He was desperately thirsty. The sight of a fat icicle hanging outside his hut in Auschwitz concentration camp caused prisoner 174517 to reach out his hand, just in the hope of assuaging his thirst. But just before he could place it in his mouth, one of the guards snatched it out of his hand and then threw it to the ground and ground it into the dirt with the heel of his jackboot. Warum? Why? The prisoner cried in astonished disbelief. Ist kein Warum, replied the guard. Here there is no why. Now, the prisoner in question was Primo Levi, who was an Italian atheist, Jewish, and a scientist. And later he wrote, "If there is an Auschwitz, then there can be no God." Does experiencing such monumental evil and suffering necessarily entail atheism? Well, many seem to think so, and maybe some of you here tonight who take that view. But someone else who was in Auschwitz was Viktor Frankl. And he came to an altogether different conclusion. He said, the truth is that amongst those who actually went through the experience of Auschwitz, the number of those whose religious life was deepened, in spite, not to say because of this experience, by far exceeds those who gave up their belief. You see, Frankl made the observation that as a weak flame can easily be blown out by a small breeze, so a weak faith might be extinguished quickly when it encounters suffering and evil. But by the same token, real faith, like a strong flame, can be fanned into an inextinguishable flame by a storm. Now, when it comes to the problem of evil and the suffering it occasions, the two can be separated, but we do need to distinguish them. Tonight we'll just try and put the two together, evil and suffering. We can't think of this in the abstract, as if it's a question which hangs all by itself in midair. You see, how we try to understand it will depend upon the beliefs we already hold, whether there's a God or gods, what this God is like, the nature of reality. For example, is there such a thing as suffering? So depending upon what we believe and how we believe, as Frankl points out, when confronted with suffering, either that belief will be snuffed out or it will be fanned into a brighter flame. Now, people often talk about the problem of suffering or the problem of pain. What do they mean? Well, first of all, let it be said quite plainly that for the thoroughgoing materialist, that is the one who believes there's no God, there's no spiritual dimension, that we live in a world without windows, to use the phrase of Peter Berger, then there is no problem in suffering, or rather, there's no problem in that suffering does not count against his or her beliefs. Suffering, like a throbbing headache or a nightmare of the gulags, are simply phenomena of existence. Pain is just an aspect of reality, like the redness of a sunset or the wetness of water. Now, of course, it may be a problem for the atheist in that he or she, like the rest of us, has to endure suffering. They have to cope with it in some way and perhaps devise some kind of philosophy which explains it. But it does not bring into question any of their core beliefs. They still have problems, but that's probably not one of them. Now, having said that, sometimes suffering does cause the atheist or the agnostic to want to shake their fist at somebody. even if it is the God they don't believe in. So might it not possibly be that when faced with suffering which is considered evil, it brings to the surface a deep-seated instinct that there is a God after all? Let me explain what I mean. Suppose you want to lay a square patio of crazy paving in your garden. And you go ahead and you order a load of broken flagstones. Once they've been delivered, there then begins the tricky business of piecing them together. And as you do so, you'll not be surprised in the least to discover that when you finish, you're left over with a few pieces which can't be placed anywhere. You're not taken aback because you've never thought that random, broken pieces were designed to fill your particular square. So it wouldn't cross your mind to contact the supplier and complain he didn't send to you the right type of flagstones for your particular garden. But now imagine that you buy a jigsaw puzzle from the shop, and you fit it all together very carefully, very thoughtfully. But at the end, you are left with some pieces missing. More than that, you have some pieces which don't seem to belong to your puzzle. Now, you do have a right to complain. You're offended. And why? Well, because underlying your complaint is the belief, rightly so, that there is intention and purpose and design behind the jigsaw puzzle. And that is what makes a jigsaw puzzle different from crazy paving. Now, a similar situation exists when we come to the question of suffering. Suffering, we feel, doesn't quite fit in with the scheme of things. Now, there would be no cause for complaint or a sense of disturbance if underneath it all we didn't believe that the world was consciously designed by a good God. So paradoxical as it may seem, the fact that we feel we have a right to complain is evidence that we really do believe there's a God to complain to. That our world is more like a well-designed jigsaw puzzle with some pieces missing or dislocated than a pile of crazy paving which we are expected to put together all by ourselves. Do you see? Now, the problem of suffering is particularly the problem for a Christian because it appears to count against what he or she believes, namely, that God is good and that God is almighty. And this has been put forward in the form of a dilemma. Originally goes back to Epicurus, a Greek philosopher, but more lately by Professor John Hick. And it goes like this. If God is perfectly loving and good, he must wish to abolish evil. If God is all-powerful, he must be able to abolish evil. But evil exists. Therefore, God can't be both perfectly good and almighty. Do you see? Now, there are, of course, some very simple solutions to this trilemma, which essentially involve the removal of one or more elements of the belief, so it ceases to be a problem. So one option would be to deny the existence of suffering. You view suffering that it's illusory in some kind of way. Now, this is the position of Theravada Buddhism, and this considers suffering, what is called dukkha, to be part of Maya, belonging to the veil of illusion, only having a reality like a dream is a reality to the person who's asleep. Similarly, the sect Christian Science, which is not particularly Christian and certainly not scientific either, considers pain to be the product of the mortal mind, with no external basis. And that reminds me of this limerick. There was once a faith healer from Deal who said, although pain is not real, when I sit on a pin and it punctures my skin, I dislike what I imagine I feel. But of course, most human beings don't see things that way. They see suffering to be objective and to be real and evil. The second alternative is to deny that God is all-powerful. That is what this particular gentleman, a process theologian called David Griffin, does. And he states unashamedly that his solution is found by, quote, denying the doctrine of omnipotence, that is, God is almighty, which is fundamental to it. In other words, God is not almighty. His experiment of creation has sort of got out of hand, and he can't do very much about it. But thirdly, there is the denial of God's goodness, which is expressed to great effect by Archibald MacLeish in his play J.B. And this is an updated presentation or representation of the story of Job. And at various intervals throughout the play, you get this haunting refrain. If he is God, he is not good. And if he is good, he is not God. And in the play, a clergyman tells J.B. that his suffering is caused by the simple fact he's a man. It's all part of the human condition. To which J.B. responds, yours is the cruelest comfort of all, making the creator of the universe the miscreator of mankind, a party to the crimes he punishes. That is, God is like some Dr. Frankenstein, who's created this monster he can't control, and then he blames the monster. But the traditional Christian claim, the claim of the Bible, is that God is good, that God is almighty, and that evil and suffering are realities to be reckoned with. So the problem then turns on how to relate these two articles of faith, the goodness and omnipotence of God, to the fact of suffering, without compromising either of these tenets of belief or trivializing human pain. Now, in turning to the question, what makes suffering morally reprehensible, evil, you've got to address a prior question. Namely, is all suffering evil, or does it only become so in certain contexts? Now, just think about it. While psychologically most pain may be considered to be disagreeable, it is not necessarily the case that it is morally so, especially if that pain endured is part of a means to a recognized good. For example, biological pain serves as part of the body's defense mechanism, preventing further injury through, say, a reflex action. You touch a hot plate, you pull away to prevent further burning. So that is good pain. In some contexts, it is morally neutral, like the healthy pain after a long exercise. Or it may be morally good, as in the case of corrective punishment. But surely what makes suffering morally objectionable is when it occurs in a form which is wholly negative. It seems to be devoid of any apparent purpose or significance. It is completely destructive. And surely it is this which lies behind the root of so many tormented human cries. Why should my 10-day-old baby die? Why should such a gifted man be reduced to a mere shell through Alzheimer's? And it's this seeming lack of purpose which provides the twist which calls for such pain to be viewed as evil, pointless suffering. Now, when we ask the question, why suffering, we could be straining in one or two different directions. First, we could be looking backward for some cause. What is the cause of suffering? Both in terms of an ultimate cause, where did it all come from in the first place? Or a more immediate cause. What is the cause of this particular suffering? Now, the Christian faith has something to say about both of these things, in terms of human beings rupturing their relationship with God, which throws all relationships out of joint, with suffering literally being a painful reminder that all is not well between ourselves and our Maker. Someone has suggested that we think of it like this. What would happen if our sun lost its place in the solar system? The answer, of course, is that there would be chaos. So you might have Mars spinning off into endless darkness. You have Saturn's rings beginning to crumble. You have Mercury flying into the sun. And there would be bits of debris of the solar system strewn everywhere. It's because they are rightly related to the sun that it actually works. Now, the Bible tells us, especially if you read Romans chapter 1, that morally and spiritually speaking, that is what has happened to humankind. God is like the sun in the solar system of our lives. And if he is removed from the center of our thinking, then our thinking and our behavior gets out of control. And soon the whole of society begins to collapse. That's one way of looking for a cause. But tonight I want to think and to focus on a second possibility, which I think is the main emphasis in the New Testament anyway. That is to look forward and ask, what might be the purpose of suffering? What good, if any, can there be in suffering? Now, of course, I've already mentioned one. It can act as a severe wake-up call for us so we realize our need to get right with our Maker. But the idea of focusing on other purposes is important. Now, this way of looking at the question was, in fact, taken up by a certain school of psychoanalysis called logotherapy. It was actually headed by Viktor Frankl, whom I've already mentioned. He experienced the horrors of Auschwitz. And it was there, of all places, that he noticed the positive way in which some people approached their situation. A nightmare situation, and that's putting it mildly. And this observation, in turn, led him to quote the philosopher Nietzsche with approval when he said that men and women can endure any amount of suffering so long as they know the why to their existence. In other words, if that suffering can be placed within some kind of a wider context of meaning and belief, then much, but by no means all, of the sting is taken out. There's always going to be an element of mystery in suffering. I don't care who you are, or what your religion, or what your philosophy. That will always remain there. So I want to ask then, how might Christians, taking the Bible seriously, face suffering, and why? Well, a number of years ago, I was a fellow trustee of a charity with a very remarkable woman, Baroness Caroline Cox. And she's the former Deputy Speaker of the House of Lords. And she's been described as the Mother Teresa of war-torn poor. She's a former nurse, and she personally supervises Christian relief to many of the war-ravaged areas of the world. And she actually goes to the front line. She gets on her hands and knees, and she actually helps with the distribution of food, clothes, and medicine. And often, when she arrives, she's greeted with these words from the various people. They say, "Thank God you've come. We thought the world had forgotten us." And once she was asked to relate both her worst and best moment during all her journeys of mercy. The worst? Well, she thought for a moment, and then described what it was like to enter a Dinka village after the Sudanese government-backed soldiers had left. The stench of death, she said, was simply overpowering. More than 100 corpses lay where they had been butchered. Men, women, little children. Even cattle had been cut down, and people had been herded into captivity as slaves. Straw huts were set ablaze. Devastation and death affronted eyes everywhere. And worst of all was the knowledge that the militia would return. Genocide is an overworked word, Baroness Cox said, and one I would never use without meaning it. But I mean it. What of her best moment? This, she said, came straight after the worst. With the raiders gone and the results of their cruelty spread all around, husbands slain, children kidnapped into slavery, homes ruined, women brutally raped, the few women still alive were pulling themselves together. And their first instinctive act was to make tiny crosses out of sticks on the ground and to push them into the earth. Now, what were they doing? Simply fashioning instant memorials to those that they've just lost? Not at all. Baroness Cox explained the cruelly formed crosses were not markers of death, but symbols of hope. The cross sticks pressed into the ground at the moment when their bodies reeled and their hearts bled were acts of faith. You see, as followers of the Lord Jesus Christ, they served a God whom they believed knew pain, as they knew pain. And blinded by pain and grief themselves, horribly aware that the world would neither know nor care about their plight, they staked their lives on the conviction that there was one who knew and who cared, and they were not alone. Now, friends, here we see the difference Christianity makes from all other beliefs. In contrast to secular humanism, which views suffering, in the words of Richard Dawkins, as just damn bad luck, necessary for the evolutionary process to get going, or Theravada Buddhism, that is a result of desire, which leads to craving, which leads to attachment, and so you're bound onto the wheel of samsara, reincarnation. I think some Hindus believe you're reincarnated 35,000 times before you're then extinguished into the deathless lake of non-existence called nirvana. Now, nirvana sounds very cool, and hey, wow, it's not. It's nothingness. No, Christianity recognizes that the world could have been otherwise, but for human sin. But God, a personal God, has taken steps to do something about it. Now, the first important point to make is that Christians unswervingly hold to the belief that God is all good. His response to suffering and the sin which it occasions is not detachment, as in Eastern religions, but engagement. He comes into the mess in order to deal with the mess by getting himself messy. In fact, more than that, it is enfleshment, which is what the word incarnation means, which Christians celebrate at Christmas. that God becomes a human being without ceasing to be God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The Christian writer, Dr. John Stott, reflecting on this truth, puts it this way. He says, I could never believe in God if it were not for the cross. The only God I believe in is the one Nietzsche ridiculed as God on the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune from it? I've entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of Buddha. His legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing around his mouth. A remote look on his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time, after a while, I've turned away. And in my imagination, I have turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross. Nails through hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from thorn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. That is God for me. He laid aside immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh and blood and tears and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become more manageable in the light of his. Oh, there's still a question mark against human suffering. But over it we boldly stamp another mark, the cross, which symbolizes divine suffering. God is good. The second point the Christian makes is that Christians, because of Christ, hold unswervingly to the belief that God is all-powerful. But his power is not always shown in the way we might expect. He's all-wise, but his wisdom is not always manifest in the way we may hope. The paradox is that divine power is shown through human weakness. That good is brought out of the most appalling evil. And again, we're back to the cross. You see, it's at the cross where we're presented with a paradox running throughout the mysterious relationship between evil of suffering and God's good purposes. Just think about it. From one point of view, the cross was the worst thing that could have happened. The murder of the divine Son. And so pinpointing so forcefully our rebellious attitude towards God. The moment the Maker comes into the world, we murder him. Yet at the same time, it was the best thing that ever happened. The divine means of rescuing us. And here we see God taking sin and suffering and evil seriously, because he tasted it at first hand in his Son, suffering physically and spiritually of a magnitude beyond our comprehension. And it was this which shaped the New Testament writer's attitude towards suffering. The belief that the outworking of what God has achieved by Jesus' death and resurrection in time would be brought to completion at the end of time, ushering in a new heaven and a new earth. I like the way the writer, Dorothy L. Sayers, expresses this thought. She says, for whatever reason God chose to make man as he is, limited in suffering and subject to sorrows and death, he had the honesty and the courage to take his own medicine. Whatever game he's playing with his creation, he's kept his own rules and played fair. He has himself gone through the whole human experience, from the trivial irritations of family life and lack of money, to the worst horrors, pain, humiliation, defeat, despair, and death. He was born in poverty and died in disgrace and felt it was all worthwhile. What was worthwhile? It was to bring us back into a restored relationship with his Father, and to prepare for something new which is to come in the future, and which he invites every one of us to share in. The third point is that because of Jesus and the cross, together with his resurrection, which marks his triumph over death, sin, and evil, Christians can content themselves that God is all-wise, that they know why they trust God who knows why, even when they don't, that there is some purpose in pain. Now, let me give you two examples of what this looks like and the difference being a Christian makes. The first is Jerry Sitzer. In 1991, a drunk driver veered across the road into his car in which he and his family were traveling. His mother, his wife, and his daughter were all killed. 3 generations wiped out in one moment. And he writes about his experience in the book A Grace Disguised, which has the rather intriguing subtitle, How the Soul Grows Through Loss. And at one point he says, it is possible to live in and be enlarged by loss, even as we continue to experience it. Sometimes I wonder about my own experience of loss, how it will someday serve a greater purpose that I do not yet see or understand. My story may help to redeem a bad past, or it may bring about a better future. Perhaps my own family heritage has produced generations of absent and selfish fathers, and I've been given a chance to reverse the pattern. Perhaps people suffering catastrophic loss will someday look to our family for hope and inspiration. I do not know. Yet I choose to believe that God is working towards some ultimate purpose, even using my loss to that end. Well, one thing is for sure, God has used his book to strengthen and encourage many whose hearts have been broken. The second person is Mary Craig, who in her book Blessings describes how 2 of her 4 sons were born with very severe abnormalities, one with Hurley syndrome and the other one with Down syndrome. And in the book, she speaks of redemptive suffering. And this is what she says. I do not believe that any suffering is ultimately pointless, although it's often difficult to go on convincing oneself. Yet the value of suffering does not lie in the pain of it, but in what the sufferer makes of it. It is in the sorrow that we discover the things that really matter. In sorrow, we discover ourselves. The Greek philosopher Socrates is said to have famously remarked, the unexamined life is not worth living. That was given an extra twist by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, that a life not put to the test is not worth living. And that applies to all of us, but especially to those of us who would claim to be Christians. So let me share with you a little thought experiment which was suggested by a friend of ours, Bishop Frank Retief of Cape Town. Now he knows what he's talking about for a variety of reasons, not least that one night his church experienced a massacre. It was about 1993, I think it was. And so it's a very large church, about 1,000, 2,000 people there. And one night, it was a stormy night. It was absolutely tipping down with rain. It was dark. It was a dreadful storm. And the service had started, so there were about 1,000 people laid out there, when through the side doors, 3 gunmen came with machine guns. They also threw in hand grenades, which were tied to tin cans containing nails. They went in, threw the bombs, machine gunned, and went out. And you can imagine the carnage. I mean, I've been to that church a few times, and you can still see the bullet holes are still there in the wall. Families lost their loved ones, children were killed, mothers were killed, children left as orphans. And that night, particularly, there were a number of Russian sailors who did a lot of work amongst Russian sailors, and they were just seated over at one particular area where the gunmen came in, and most of those were killed, and quite a number lost legs and limbs. So he knows what he's talking about. And may also say that I think everyone in South Africa would say that event was probably one of the instrumental things which led to the end of apartheid and the end of all the violence that was going on, because the whole nation was so shocked by what had happened. God used it in that way, as well as many, many people becoming Christians. But this is what he says. He said, imagine that you've been brought up in the perfect family. You've never heard your mom or dad exchange a cross word with each other. And they were patient and kind all the time, and you too were perfect from the day you were born. You never had nappy rash. You never had mumps. You never had colic or measles or any of the other things that babies tend to have. And of course, when you went to school, everything just worked out right for you. You never failed an exam. You were always top of the class. You excelled in sports, and you were exemplary in your behavior. And you never had to go to the dentist to have your brace fixed because your teeth were perfect, great for a Colgate ad. And then you managed to go to university, and you sailed through. Yes, you got the top grades. You were voted student of the year. You never got drunk. You were never late for your lecture. You always went to church. You were just a fantastic person. And later on, you met this stunner of a girl, and guess what? She came from the perfect family too. She never had nappy rash or mumps. She got the right grades, had the right hair, and perfect teeth. And then you got married. And you had the most brilliantly paid job. You have a wonderful house. You have a car. You have no student debts. And in due time, children come along. And yes, you've guessed it, they're perfect. They never have nappy rash. They never have mumps. They sail through school, go to university, they get married, and so on it goes. And at the ripe old age of 107, never having had a day's illness in your life, you pass over from this world to the next. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But then ask this question. Who would ever know that you were a Christian? Oh, you could say you were, but who'd really know? But the only way people will really see the difference our faith makes, what we're really trusting in, is when the world turns against us. When trouble comes our way and calamity overtakes us. Because only then can we prove to the world and perhaps to ourselves that we have something better than they have. And surely that's right. The ideal life means nothing unless it's also the tested life. And if you're here tonight and you're not yet a Christian, it's great to have you with us, it really is. I just want to ask this. What kind of beliefs do you hold which will enable you to face up to the problem of pain? Thank you.